All right, so for this video, we're going to be talking about Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, and I will also briefly touch upon some of the points in the critical article that goes along with this reading. Um, Obviously, in class, we would be able to have a better discussion of what y'all thought of these, but um, this will at least get you through some of the ideas. And obviously, that critical analysis article is only one point of view on this story. There are a lot of different critical analysis studies on Hemingway in general, as well as this particular story. So, getting into it, Hemingway lived from 1899 to 1961. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954 and the Pulitzer Prize in 1953. He was a journalist for a while, so he did get that um, uh, prize for his journalistic work. Especially, he was a journalist during the Spanish War after World War II. So that definitely helped him. And his journalism actually was something that's what he got started with first. And he wanted to break into writing more with fiction and such. And it was his friend Gertrude Stein, who's another famous writer, who influenced him and told him that, as long as you continue to do journalism, you're not going to have time to do fiction writing. You really need to choose between the two. So eventually he does choose pure writing. He influenced a lot of American and British fiction in the 20th century, especially yeah, even into today, but with his modernist style, which we'll talk about the modernist writers in just a bit, as well as his very minimalist style, that is unique to, no, not unique to Hemingway. There's a lot of minimalist writers, but it is very well known that Hemingway writes minimalistically, and we can see this in his style, the fact that he doesn't have a lot of long, flowy, flowery, complicated sentences. A lot of it is just straight to the point information. Of his famous novels, he writes The Sun Also Rises. He has a novella, The Old Man and the Sea, another novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, A Farewell to Arms, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. A lot of these are also based on some of his own real life experiences, such as the character of Santiago, which is the main character of The Old Man and the Sea, is based on a fishing captain whom he knew between Key West and Cuba. And one of his other famous short stories that is commonly studied is Hills Like White Elephants. So, uh, getting more into him, he had a life of adventure, like I said, doing a lot of writing and journalism, especially as a war correspondent. During World War II, he was briefly investigated by the FBI. They were looking at everyone who had potential ties uh, to Europe, more specifically to the Axis powers. He was also at one point falsely reported dead. And, it's not like now where you could easily access and talk to someone and say, like, hey, are you alive or not? So it was a surprise to many people when he was not dead. He also had a very particular fondness for six-toed cats. He did have a house in Key West that is still a museum today. And you'll see in the module and learning materials for this week, I did post some pictures. It's not every picture I took at the Hemingway house, but when I got to visit it, when I visited Key West, if you're interested. So the house itself was built prior to Hemingway coming to Key West, and it has its own history there, including the fact that it was one of the first houses with ceiling fans, which was, pretty. Um new luxury for many people when we first got electricity. And it is built out of the limestone that builds up the islands of Key West. So it is a very strong and sturdy building. It has survived multiple hurricanes. So when Hemingway married, I believe it was his second wife, he he was supposed to be flying into Key West, and they were going to pick up a brand new car that his wife's uncle had purchased for them. It was a brand new Model T. And then they would use it to drive up to Connecticut, where they were supposed to be, going to visit friends and start establishing their life together. And unfortunately, the car was delayed, so they had to stay in Key West for a while, and they just fell in love with the tiny community and the beauty of Key West. And they fell in love with this particular house, so they purchased it. They did a lot of different things to it. Um, his writing studio is above the old barn, and he had at one point a walkway that he could literally use this tiny kind of precarious walkway to go from his bedroom on the second floor over to his writing studio. Obviously, there were separate stairs. You can go up to the writing studio as well. But he just fell in love with these six-toed cats, and he rescued them. Um, and he had cats kind of just roaming all over the grounds, and at one point up to 150 cats. And he cared for them and loved them, and so now even today, with his house being a museum of where he lived, the original creators of the house, his writing studio, they still have six-toed cats on the property. They kind of own the place, as you'll see from if you look at some of the pictures that I took. And like, humans are not allowed to just randomly sit on the historic furniture, but the cats have free reign. And now they don't have as many cats. They have a lot, but they choose based on each litter which of the cats has the best genes to move forward, and then they allow that one to stay intact and breed, and then the others are neutered, but they get to stay on the property. Um, there's a lot of interesting stories about his property. When he was overseas for the Spanish War, it was highly likely that he was cheating on his wife with a fellow journalist. And of course, his wife found out, and she had been kind of rallying for a pool. So she, in revenge, she had his boxing area dismantled and put in a pool instead. And when he found out about it, when he got back home, he actually stuck a penny into the concrete that was still drying. And you can still see it today. It's been glassed over to protect it. But that she would have his last cent, because she also liked things very fancy, Mrs. Hemingway. She tore out the most of the ceiling fans, which for us would be like, why? That's useful. Because she wanted to have Tiffany lamps. And the joke when I went on the tour was, of course, why would we have a Tiffany lamp in the bedroom for the two young boys? Because they definitely cared about a Tiffany lamp. um so yeah, his house is very interesting. The tours are great. So if you're ever in Key West, definitely check it out. Some other stuff about him: he drove ambulances for the Red Cross during World War One. Since he could not fight, he had some medical issues. And like I said, because he was a journalist, he was fascinated with war. Later, did more as a war correspondent. But this because obviously he didn't fight in World War One, but driving the ambulances, he was still on the front line, still helping with the war effort and helping take care of the wounded. So he is a solid part of the lost generation. So we had briefly touched on this with Faulkner, but compared to Faulkner, Hemingway was much more a part of it. He would join the literary salons, which were just basically get-togethers and discussions of writing and sharing the writing. And so he is definitely one of the key Lost Generation writers. And as we can see with this story, A Clean Well Lighted Place in particular, as the article kind of suggests, it focuses a lot on um, what is the idea of the humanists versus more the enlightenment ideas of more like the 1800s. And part of that is thinking about what is life? What is the purpose of life? All of this idea, especially because I believe I touched on it before. World War One is not just the first war on a major world stage, but it's also the first war with new weapons. We have things that, if we think about the gas weapons that are now against the Geneva Conventions, if we think about the uh, the fact that we now have automatic, basically guns that can shoot more than one bullet at a time before being reloaded. The fact that um, that we have tanks, we have airplanes, and it was learning on the fly. It was learning, for American soldiers going to Europe, how do we fight in unfamiliar territory? How do we fight in trenches? That was a new form of warfare that they didn't just learn through studying and strategizing. It was kind of learn on the go. So it was a very significant issue for many people. And for a lot of the writers of the Lost Generation, especially those who served during the war, this idea of existentialism, what does life mean? What is our purpose? Plays a lot in their writing. Now, because of a lot of his different issues, he did suffer from alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. And for the latter two, he was hospitalized for it. And, again, we did recognize at this time period that people who came back from World War One came back differently than those who did not go to war. But obviously it's nowhere near what we call PTSD today. We called it shell shock. We didn't recognize the full effects of it, or, the full problems from it, how to, mental health treatment alone wasn't a thing, let alone for the people who had shell shock. So when he was hospitalized, one of the popular treatments at the time was to give electroshock treatments and cold baths and a lot of different things that they thought maybe shocking the system kind of uh you know this idea of not quite turn it off and on again, but re stimulate the system. Maybe that would fix things. And obviously, it usually didn't. It made things a lot worse, and they're very dangerous treatments. So eventually, he does succumb to depression and takes his own life in 1961. So, A Clean Well Lighted Place, this was originally published in Scribner's Magazine in 1933. It was later published in Hemingway's collection, Winter Takes Nothing. So we can look at, for this story, for a lot of people, per Hemingway style, it's very straightforward, easy to understand in the fact of, we can see how the old man, there's nothing complicated, not a lot of, Hemingway used to argue there's not a lot of meaning to his stories, yet we can analyze and the stories support these analyses. And uh, but where some confusion sometimes lies with this story is in the talking back and forth between the old waiter and the young waiter. There are, between the fact that we don't get character names for any of our three characters, we also get that there's points where you don't know who's talking. And that can lead to some interesting analysis because it obviously the old man who sits in the shadows and is drunk and is reported to have taken or tried to have taken his life previously. We have for him, he never talks. We don't really know his story. We just see him kind of drunk, kind of by himself in the shadows on the edge of the light of the cafe, which is, as the article said, very much representative of, these people who are on the edge of this existentialism versus, we see the older waiter, again, like the article says, more sticking to the light and this idea of enlightenment. We can also argue that these are three representations of the different, um, not necessarily generations, but different mindsets after World War One. So you have the old man who is depressed, kind of staying to the shadows, but clearly does not want to be alone, is willing. Sorry, the dogs were barking. So, as I was saying, we can look at not really a representation of the different generations, but how the different people reacted. So the old man kind of represents this idea of the people who, after World War One were left in the dark and were, kind of struggling a lot. They didn't know how to adapt to this new society, because obviously the 1900s, everything started evolving very quickly. I mean, you think about, we went from the airplane in 1904, that was very basic, to the first man on the moon in 1969, much more advanced. Everything, and technology included, goes very quickly. And, we see it today where a lot of people, the older they are, the harder it is for them to keep up with the advancements in society, not just technologically, but being different than what they grew up in. So we can see the old man, again, not just as a generation difference, but anyone after World War One who just felt this extreme sense of loss. How do we connect? Clearly, he's not connecting. He doesn't have that human connection. We don't know a lot about him. And this kind of goes into that, this point of view is what we'd call the objective point of view, because we are basically just observing the scene. We don't know a lot of the information that's going on, and what we're told about the old man, we can't necessarily trust. It's based on rumors that he was so depressed about life that he tried to end it, and that his niece found him and helped him. But clearly, obviously, if we think about the fact that, for that old man, his niece probably has her own life, her own things that she needs to do. She can't be there with him at all times. And clearly, he doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have children of his own, but even then, children of their own have lives that they have to tend to, that they can't necessarily be there for every single moment of this person's life. And so he finds comfort in being around people, but kind of on the edges. He's at the edge of the light. He's not, he's at the cafe, but he's not. And, for the older waiter, he is that kind of in between. He still feels, we can see, especially when they close up the cafe, he still feels lost. He doesn't want to go home. He doesn't have a wife to go home to. He doesn't, his purpose is going to the cafe to work and to serve people and to stay in the light as well. Trying to stay positive about things, but still recognizing, especially through, the Lord's Prayer, that he says, substituting the word nada throughout, which is Spanish for nothing, substituting that throughout the prayer, as this question of what is life? What is our purpose? What is the idea of praying to a deity to help us when we don't understand what it is maybe we're asking for, what it is that is our purpose, what do we need? what is that deity going to be able to help us with? Um, depending on, how you worship and what religion you are. So, he really represents that in between. He's trying to keep up with the advancements of modern society. Obviously for the 1900s, not our modern society, but he's still struggling as well. Whereas the younger waiter, he really represents this. Sorry, the dogs went crazy because there was an Amazon truck this time. But the younger waiter, he's the epitome of keeping up with it. He has everything to live for. So, he's, again, as the article states, kind of this in between. To him, the cafe is a place to work, but it's not where he wants to be. He wants to be home with his wife, enjoying his life, with her. He's going to work because he has to, not because he wants to. So, and again, like I just said, the article says, he's connected between two places, whereas for the old man and the older waiter, they are kind of this liminal space that they are connected to. So, we can look at the fact that this story, a lot of people look at it as a way of talking about depression and different ways. We can do a lot of analysis of the characters and their attitude. Again, where some of the, I got off track, but some of the confusion where we don't know who's talking between the two waiters, that can be confusing because, again, we assume that the younger waiter is the one who is being a little more blasé, a little more rude about the old man being there because he's the one that we see go up and even though the old man can't hear him, he says horrible things to him and he just wants to close down the cafe for the night so he can get home to his wife. Whereas we don't see that as much with the older waiter. So we assume that's him talking. But obviously, if, that's one of the areas where we get confusion as to who may be talking, we assume it's the younger waiter. What if it was the older waiter who's being more blasé about things, what and more rude, what would that suggest to us? So this tone, it's a very manner of fact journalistic tone about this story because again we're just getting a very objective view of this is what happened here, here's the facts, nothing but the facts, thank you, good night, a very journalistic style that is typical of many of Hemingway's stories. We can also see that connection with the lost generation, again, not just depression and this question in general about what is our purpose in life, but also those who fought in the war, those who came back changed and lost everything versus those who maybe were more in between but struggling versus those who perhaps didn't go to war and kind of grow up with that privilege of not knowing the struggles in life and being able, and beyond having to go to work when you want to be home playing with your family, as we see with the younger waiter. We could also see it, it doesn't have to be just someone, it doesn't have to be just those who served during the war. We could think of the old man, you know, we know he doesn't, we don't know a lot about him. We know obviously the fact that he's staying all night at the cafe and drinking, the fact that his niece is the one who prevented his suicide, all of those things suggest he probably doesn't have his own family, a wife and kids. It doesn't mean he didn't at one point. Maybe this is someone representative of a generation who lost their child to the war and is depressed about that. So there's a lot of things that we could connect with the lost generation. Now, again, Hemingway's style is very unique as that minimalist style, not giving a lot of detail, just giving us kind of straight the facts, which is very similar to journalism. But this is also a time period. where a lot of the writings we consider under a modernism or modernist period. And obviously, when we talk about it, when they use the word modern, we use it to mean the time of the day. Like, modern to us would be 2026. But modernism as a style is the early 1900s to pretty much about World War II. And there are a lot of writers that follow this style. And there's some hallmarks that Hemingway features in some of his stories, some he doesn't. One of the hallmarks of modernism is, besides this connection with the lost generation, this idea of self-consciousness. We're starting to get more into psychology during this time period. So we have a lot of writing that shows the kind of thought process. So instead of just the sterilized, edited version of a thought process that we might see in a character, what's the exact flow of thoughts? So, like in James Joyce's writing, we see um, flow of thoughts like as if it would be in someone's real head. The stream of consciousness is what they call it, of how does one thought connect to another, even randomly, and just see the flow of thoughts for someone. We also get um more so with the other modernist writers, this idea of being fancy and showing education, because one issue during this time period that stems in writing and why it gets so fancy is we do have more women and minorities starting to publish, especially post 1920s. And so there were a lot of um, white men who felt like they needed to prove that their writing was still above and beyond everyone else's. So they felt that, using, oh, well, I'm educated and, I'll use more flowery language and techniques and styles. It doesn't always hold people's attention. Now, again, Hemingway's kind of anti that. He's much more that minimalist style, but these are different hallmarks of that modernist style. So the characters, we talked about the older man, the older waiter, the younger waiter. Another thing that I want to point out too is some people will analyze, what if these are all representations of the same person at different points in their life. So we can see the younger waiter as being, when a person, is younger, and they have all this energy and they want to do all these things, but they have to work in order to make a living. They don't want to be there. They want to be enjoying time with the people they love. And then, we get to the fact of like the older waiter, he clearly he either doesn't have a wife or no longer has a partner, etc. Um, and people not around him, so he hesitates. He likes going to work and working with around other people because he doesn't want to be alone, and he finds comfort in working still and being around other people. Whereas the older man, we see he's kind of towards the end of his life. He really has no one else around him. He's probably not okay to work still like the older waiter to keep people around him, so he ends up going to, these places to, still be around people in a way. And we could probably also talk about some analysis on that older man, of the idea, for centuries, the idea of taking care of the older generation um has always been important no matter what culture. And obviously, we lost a lot of young people during both World War One and World War Two across the world, not just America. So this idea of not having enough young people to take care of the older generation did start to shift ideas. And it's not like it was, I don't want to use the word burden as a negative, because it's a very negative term. And it's not saying that, that it's a good thing, bad thing, etc. But or that throughout history people were like, I'll happily take care of the older generation. There were definitely people who felt it was a burden to have to take care of the older generation when they themselves were trying to take care of themselves as well as the younger generation below them. And so it's always been this difficult balance. But then add in that, there were a lot of people after World War One, World War Two who didn't have families who would take that on. So, we have the fact of having nursing homes in a lot of these places that start, to advance. And how do we take care of it so that way it's not just treating people like they're a burden because they can't take care of themselves, but they can't, and we don't want them to be alone and depressed, but also how do we balance that with, you know, proper care for those people in their older age, respect for those people, as well as care and respect for the people taking care of them, as well as quality of life for the people. So we could talk about the fact that, this is a shifting time period for these, for the older generation as well. And it's scary to think about, what's going to happen to you. And like for a lot of people, the idea of having kids isn't just so that you have someone to take care of you when you're older, but that definitely is a potential of, hey, someone will know what to do when I can no longer make that decision for myself. And so when you don't have that, it can be scary. Like, what's going to happen to me? Am I just going to be put somewhere and forgotten? So there's a lot of different analyses that we can do on the characters in the story, despite that we don't get a lot of information about them. For themes and symbols, obviously the idea of despair, meaning and meaninglessness, youth and age. There's a lot of contrast, light and dark, night and day, youth and old. Dissatisfaction as a theme, mortality, drugs and alcohol, old age in general. The biggest symbol itself in this story is the cafe, because it does represent, the fact that we can see the old man is by a light at the edge of the cafe and the shadows. We can see like the light shining in the darkness. We can see the idea of um the cafe being there for people. We can also look at again the a cafe in was usually the place of the salons that the Lost Generation writers would go to. So what did it mean to them? How is it perhaps representative of these writers? Was the cafe a light in the darkness for the Lost Generation to go to these salons and think and discuss with people who thought like them, and work out, because writing through these stories is a way to potentially work out issues that the writer has themselves. So there's a lot of ways that we can take that cafe. We can also look that in the beginning of the story it mentions the soldier and the young woman passing by. Why is there a soldier at this? We look at this as being around 1930s when this was written. So, still kind of pre-World War II officially. And so looking at that, we can see that um you know, why is that soldier, are they just walking with a lover? Again, that could be another representation of different time periods, compared to the waiter who is married, the soldier who is flirting and not married yet. Um, why is there a soldier walking in the street? There's a lot of things that we can pull from the story. So, again, if you're interested in those pictures, they are on Brightspace, labeled as Hemingway House Pictures. You can look at stuff, and I'm happy to discuss more about Hemingway at any time. For the other story for this week, make sure to check out the next video. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please reach out.